The next panel, which come up and take your seats, is on undercover reporting. It's one of the most dangerous kinds of reporting. It's reporting that has ethical and sometimes physical challenges. And it's obviously reporting that's been in litigation. And here to lead the panel, and by popular demand, is NPR's Ailsa Chang. Since moderating a panel at last year's symposium, she has switched beats after years of covering Congress. She's now on the Planet Money team.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. This is always such a fun symposium. I am really especially honored to be here this year because of the 4 reporters that are up here with me. All of the stories that we're going to be talking about today require taking on tremendous risks, and we'll be talking about those risks today, but I just also want to say how incredibly generous I think it is for these 4 people to come here and share with all of us how they did what they did, because undercover reporting can be a really touchy subject in a room full of reporters like this, right? I mean, as journalists, we seek truth, but are there cases where getting at that truth justifies less than truthful means? That's a question newsrooms across the country have varying viewpoints about. And even if you do believe that there is a role for undercover reporting in your newsroom, what's the best way to do it? Are there improper versus proper ways to go undercover? We're going to talk about all of that today. But before we get started, I just want to introduce these amazing panelists really quick. Shane Bauer, right here next to me, is a senior reporter at Mother Jones magazine. In 2015, he took a job as a prison guard in Louisiana to investigate corporate-run prisons. That turned into an award-winning piece called My 4 Months as a Private Prison Guard. Soon after, he went undercover again with the border militia in Arizona. He just can't get enough, apparently. Shane has won a string of awards over the years, including the National Magazine Award for Best Reporting, a Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, a Hillman Prize for Magazine Journalism, and 2 John Jay Awards for Criminal Justice Reporting. Suki Kim is an investigative journalist and novelist who is the only writer, as far as we know, who has ever gone undercover in North Korea. What came out of that is a best-selling book called Without You, There Is No Us, Undercover Among the Sons of North Korea's Elite. Suki was born in South Korea and emigrated to the US when she was 13. Her writing has appeared in Harper's, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the New Republic, where she's a contributing editor. James Jones is an award-winning documentary maker. His films have tackled a vast array of subjects, from suicide in the military to homelessness in the United Kingdom. He's also helped shine a light on dangerous places around the globe that are often hidden from the rest of the world, places like North Korea and Gaza, and more recently, what we'll be talking about today, Saudi Arabia. James' work has won him an Emmy, a DuPont, a Grierson, and a Roy Peck Award. And finally, we have Tracie McMillan, who is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The American Way of Eating, undercover at Walmart, Applebee's, Farm Fields, and the dinner table. That book earned her the Sidney Hillman Prize for Book Journalism, a James Beard Journalism Award, and an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. She's also a writer for The Plate, which is National Geographic's blog covering food issues. So thanks so much for joining us. To start things off real quick, I think what we're going to do first is just go around and each of you spend about 5 minutes giving a brief overview of what your project's about. And Shane, I'm just going to start with you. Again, you spent 4 months working as a guard in a prison run by Corrections Corporation of America, the second largest private prison company in the country. Can you tell us, what was the story that you were trying to tell, and why was going undercover absolutely the only way you could tell it?
I would say the story I was trying to tell was, I wanted to give a portrait in a sense of what life is like inside of a private prison. And these prisons have existed since the early 1980s, early to mid 1980s, and we haven't had a good look inside of them throughout the duration of their existence. I mean, there's been reporting when there's riots, people will gather information from lawsuits and get what they can, but these institutions are very secretive. They don't, public records laws often don't apply to them because they're not public institutions. And they're very difficult to get inside. And the few cases I know of people of reporters who've been inside, you get, like in most prisons, you get an hour-long tour, and that's it. So it's very controlled. And so I felt that the only way to really see what was going on was to get a job. And that allowed me not only to kind of get the important kind of data, like how many people are working there. There were 23, 24 people showing up for work for 1,500 prisoners. How often people were getting stabbed, which was much higher than what the company was reporting, and all those kind of data points. But it also, I think more importantly, allowed me to show the kind of granularity of that place and the moments that illustrate what it's like in there, and not and paint a picture that is showing a total system, not just a kind of a little sliver. So I essentially was going in to, as much as I could, be a fly on the wall, which is not what the experience was like. I was a part of it. I was a guard, and a lot of my energy ended up being focused on that, and figuring out how to get through the days, how to be a guard, and that also was in a sense another data point. It's like it's more information. Like how do you do this job in a place that is so bare bones? It's run for profit, where guards. You have 2 guards for 350 prisoners, and all you have are radios, and you're making $9 an hour, and all of these things add up to something, to a total, which is the thing I wanted to get at. So that was the story of prisoners, the story of guards. It's the interplay between them and all of it.
And did you have a video clip you wanted to throw to?
Oh, sure. I actually don't know what the video clip is, so. We published, I think, 5 videos with the article online, just kind of hitting at some of these different aspects. I'm not sure what this one is, so let's
That was lockdown.
Oh, okay. Oh, this was a time when, so I'd been there for a few months, and the prison was essentially deteriorating while I was there. It was severely understaffed. There was a big spike in violence, and the state, or actually before that, the prison company sent in these tactical teams from around the country that are company employees, and locked the prison down. They couldn't run it, so they locked it down, which meant that prisoners couldn't basically leave their dorms. They're living in dorms of 44 guys, and the state eventually took over as well. Briefly, it just occupied the prison essentially, and was kind of saying, we need to show you guys how to run this place. This company that had been running the prison for over 20 years. There seems to be some kind of escalation going on. It just feels like this whole thing is like coming to a head. The security is so bad. And it's just this cauldron, this kind of boiling pot that I'm stuck inside. The prison has been on lockdown for about a week. CCA has sent in SORT teams from its prisons around the country to try to bring Wynn under control.
SORT team is like a wrecking crew. They dress them all in black. They normally whoop ass first and take names later.
They're basically going throughout the entire prison very thoroughly and methodically.
Tear the mattresses up, tear the vents up, whatever they need to do to find any contraband.
Strip searching inmates, searching toilets, searching their lockers. People are getting angry. They're lashing out. I thought that there was going to be a riot in the unit that I work in.
If we want to act like refugees and animals, then we can do.
We not acting like it. That's how we being treated.
Listen to what I say.
Hey, that's how we being treated. We ain't got nothing.
They were supposed to get canteen today, which they haven't had for 3 weeks. They just kind of start freaking out. No, they said no COs are going to come on the tier. We're not doing count. We're not cooperating. We're going to riot.
This is the incompetence that's causing these problems. The inability to be able to run this place in a professional manner. The people here are so lazy from where they go, and their solution to the problem is lock everybody down. Come on, man, you need a brainiac, somebody that could think, somebody that could come in here with finesse and run the prison and deal with these problems. CCA policy is what's creating a lot of bullshit.
We're going to return to what it's like to navigate as a reporter under such stressful conditions, but I wanted to get to Suki real quick. Suki, you spent 6 months as an English teacher undercover, teaching at an evangelical university in Pyongyang. You had 270 students. All of them were young men from elite families in North Korea. What was the question you were trying to answer when you first set out to do this?
It was a project that took about a decade. It began in 2002. I first went there really out of actually personal interest, as well as journalistic. So that time I went it by joining an obscure organization that's actually pro-Kim Jong-il organization based in New Jersey. And it was only when I arrived in Pyongyang, I was actually billed as a youth leader for the Great Leader. So I was, taking on that role of this youth leader, having come to Pyongyang to celebrate the 60th birthday celebration of Kim Jong-il, who was the then Great Leader back in 2002. I did a long cover essay for New York Review of Books, long-form journalism. And this whole then began my research into this topic and trying to understand North Korea in a deeper way. Then I began interviewing over 100 defectors in all the surrounding region by going to the border of China, Mongolia, Laos, Thailand, South Korea, and also started interviewing separated families. And I come from a separated family myself. There's about 1 million of them that happened as a result of the Korean War, which ended in 1953. So now we have 70 years of this forced separation. So all of these things are not really discussed. How were two Koreas created, even beginning with that, and how these 3 generations of people who missed each other, the longing that just got lost. So this issue wasn't just about this nuclear North Korea or famine in North Korea. There was so much of heartbreak that I felt as a writer who writes narrative investigative journalism that I could do. I kept going in. I went to North Korea 5 times. Each time you see really nothing. And I covered the Philharmonic for Harper's Magazine by going to Pyongyang in 2008. The same thing. Then I found out about this school. I knew that I had to live in Pyongyang. It was the only way I could actually fully capture it. And I ended up finding out about this school that was being built for the elite in Pyongyang. It seemed like a random thread to follow. But I pursued with them for about 3 years, and finally, it was evangelical Christian organization, and I applied for a job as an ESL teacher with them, and they amazingly accepted me for that role. So I went in when the school opened, and ended up living, that year, it was 2011 when I finally went in my 5th time to live there, and it was this military compound, and 270 young men, but also 2011 was the 100th year of North Korea's founding, meaning they were celebrating, you just saw the military march, but this was just far bigger because it was 100th year of their foundation of that nation. He was Kim Il-sung's 100th birthday celebration. So they shut down every university in the whole country for a year, and they put all the university students into construction fields, except the sons of elite, whom they plucked out of their top schools, Kim Il-sung University, Kim Chek University are both Harvard and MIT of North Korea. So they plucked them out and put them in this safe place. So obviously something big was going to happen in this country. So because the leaders didn't want their sons in doing manual labor. So this is the campus I found myself living.
Those were your students?
Those were my students. I had to live with them. None of us were allowed out of this campus. It was complete surveillance 24/7 with minders who literally was downstairs from me watching me 24/7.
We'll talk about that, yeah. Save that for
So
later.
basically what I was after by living with them was, I think I was really, the bigger story of this humanity behind it. Defectors all come from bottom class. So you either get the victim story or the crazy Kim Jong-un story. So where is the humanity? Because if you don't feel humanity for those people, then there is no empathy for that nation that's under captivity. So basically what I was trying to go after was not this Wikipedia of is North Korea starving. It's more, what are they really thinking? Who are they? I found them incredibly fascinating, lovable, and also sad. So that's what I was after, trying to capture North Korea in a way that we can empathize as actually people.
Thank you. James, to produce your film Saudi Arabia Uncovered, you did something a little bit different. You relied on a small network of activists already inside Saudi Arabia to secretly film public punishments, even public executions, women getting harassed in shopping malls. Why did you decide to enlist activists already in the country to be your eyes and ears?
It was a model that we'd used before, actually, in North Korea and in ISIS-controlled Raqqa and places like that, kind of secretive, repressive regimes where you couldn't just turn up with a camera and film openly. And we'd worked with activists, and on the whole, we'd managed to meet them out. So in North Korea, we met them in China, showed them how to use a camera, kind of tried to give them a crash course in journalistic ethics and kind of safety protocol, and then sent them back in. And so we basically decided to try the same model with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, it's slightly different. It's not kind of international pariah state. It's not a terrorist organization. It's actually a kind of close ally of Britain and America, which added a whole layer of extra complexity and difficulty. But I remember the moment we had the idea, I was watching the news in January 2015, and a clip came up, and it was cell phone footage shot over someone's shoulder of a young man in a square in front of a mosque surrounded by a cheering crowd. And he was being whipped publicly. And, at first glance, you thought it's just another ISIS kind of propaganda video or something from inside Raqqa. And then we realized that it was a young Saudi blogger called Raif Badawi, who'd been sentenced to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes for his mild criticism of the regime and insulting Islam. And it got me thinking, just the drama in the footage of this guy who, in Saudi Arabia, you get sent to prison for 10 years for a tweet, you get locked up for filming in the slums. So for this guy to take the risk of filming over someone's shoulder and constantly having to hide, and then sharing it among this kind of network of activists, got me thinking, this is going to be difficult and controversial potentially, but there must be people inside Saudi Arabia who share our values of kind of liberalism and tolerance and freedom of speech, but many of those people, like Raif Badawi, were kind of locked up in prisons. But we managed, in this instance, to tap into this network through Saudi dissidents in London, and very slowly through encrypted apps. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not North Korea, so we were able to, text people using encrypted apps, and there's a huge advantage to be able to kind of manage the people that we were working with. With North Korea, it was unlike anything I'd ever done before. Our security protocol, usually you have 60 pages of detail about what happens in any given scenario. With North Korea, we had no contact with these people for months on end. I mean, the advantage we had with Saudi was that we could. Technology is good. We could speak to them. And we found one guy who we called Yasser in the film, who was a young guy, a student, who was willing to use the undercover camera and film on the streets, film, as you said, women being harassed by religious police. And again, the fact that Saudis had cell phones meant that it was even harder for the regime to control what they were able to film. So they would film stuff on their cell phones, share it among the network in these encrypted apps, and it would kind of get out to us. And I think we're going to show you a clip which is quite graphic, so just to warn you about that. But it's an interesting case. It ends with a public punishment, and it's kind of revealing about the position Saudi Arabia finds itself in that for years and years they've used public punishments to kind of instill fear in the population. But now that technology has improved and people can film these things on their cell phones, they're suddenly terrified of these getting out to the outside world and kind of humiliating them. So increasingly now they do it behind closed doors. They executed 47 people in one day last year. So just to warn you, there is a graphic scene at the end of this clip.
King Abdullah introduced welfare handouts of more than $100 billion, some social reform, and employment opportunities for the poor. At the same time, the regime stepped up its use of strict Sharia law to control the population. In Saudi Arabia, executions can be carried out publicly with one sword blow to the neck. The underground network tries to distribute videos of public punishments caught on camera. This Burmese woman was convicted of sexually assaulting and killing her stepdaughter. Headless bodies are sometimes put on display as a warning. The Saudi government says that only the most serious criminals are executed, and that punishments are carried out according to Sharia law.
Since the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia, I think, is undergoing an identity crisis. On the one hand, they are talking about changing the economy of Saudi Arabia and genuine political reform. But Saudi Arabia last year in 2015 executed more people than ever in recent memory. And the judiciary and the legal system are basically an arm of the regime to institute its policy against dissent.
The regime basically shuts down the opposition. It imprisons them. It attacks them. I don't think this is Islam. All the people are angry, but the problem is they can't speak. Everyone is scared of being imprisoned.
And Tracie, I now want to very quickly introduce your project. You went undercover in garlic fields in California, in the produce section of a Walmart in Michigan, at an Applebee's in Brooklyn, all to tell a story about access to food and how our food system is basically organized. Why did you choose those three places to go undercover to tell this story?
Right, so when I was beginning to conceptualize this book and sort of start to think about doing this kind of a project, this was in the mid-aughts, so 2006, 2007, when all the discussion around Michael Pollan, right, who's a professor here at the J School, around sort of local food. And I had actually been working primarily as a welfare reporter in New York City, and I bristled a lot at the tone of that conversation because it felt so deeply removed from the daily life of, I mean, not only just me, right, but the folks that I was reporting on in New York City. So I wanted to do a project that would really look at how the food system really works, right? Because I sort of understood, well, it's industrial, but what does that mean? What does that look like? What do choices really look like for folks? You know, because a lot of folks were like, why don't you go to like a nice organic farm and write about like the positive things? I was like, well, I don't really even know what happens at a regular farm. So I'm gonna go. And I was like, okay, so if I'm going to look at what it takes to eat well, that ended up being sort of the framing concept for the book, like what would it take for America to eat well? I was like, well, fruits and vegetables. Okay, so I need to go work in farm fields that produce fruits and vegetables. Central Valley produces, I think, around a third of the fruits and vegetables consumed in the U.S. So I decided I would come out to California and work in industrial fields. Walmart is the largest grocer in the U.S. And the second largest in the world. It currently represents about 17 or 18% of American grocery sales. Just for comparison, the early 20th century, A&P was broken up by antitrust things for having too much market share when it was at 9%. And then Applebee's, right, is the largest sort of casual sit-down place. And I liked that it was a place that, like, almost every American that's gone out to eat has gone to an Applebee's, right? So it might be that you're like a working class family that goes there for a special night out. You might be someone from the coast with more money, but when you go visit family or something, you stop. And I wanted to sort of look at these institutions, right, that are very ingrained in American experience and sort of dig in and be like, okay, so if we want this stuff to serve health and sort of be good for us, what does that look like? How do we do that?
Right. So there are two themes I want to get at, two broader themes I want to get at during this panel. One is, how does a journalist go about pulling off undercover reporting? And secondly, I want to talk about this larger question of, when is undercover reporting justified? So let's start with the how-to. And on that front, for three of you, going undercover meant actually getting hired by the people, or hired to work for the people you were investigating. And Shane, what I'm curious about is what each of you chose to reveal truthfully about yourselves when you were applying for these jobs. And I know, Shane, you used your real name. You were totally Googleable, right, when you applied for a job with CCA?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of ground rule was that I don't lie, but I don't have to, offer information. Obviously, I had an interest in getting inside to report. And so when I filled out an application, I answered the questions that were required, like my name, my current employer, which I listed the parent organization, Mother Jones Foundation for National Progress, some of my job history. I happen to I used to be a welder, so I put those kind of things up top. And, I never had any indication they actually read the application. And so
you had also reported on prisons before. Like, if you were Googled, they would see Shane Bauer byline under prison stories. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you have their famous Food Lion case. ABC News went undercover and at this food chain and exposed that they were, repackaging spoiled meat. The company sued, and it's a long, drawn-out, years-long lawsuit. But they eventually, the part that stuck in the lawsuit was had to do with the fact that they had misrepresented themselves in their application, saying that they had prior experience that they didn't actually have. So you have to be very careful about that stuff. And so, when I told my editors about this idea, it was just like, give it a try. I didn't think it would work, but I don't think they did either. And I just was like, let me fill out the application. It takes 2 hours. And then I got phone calls a couple weeks later asking for interviews.
And Suki, you also used your real name. You applied with your actual qualifications, right? Did you tell them you were American?
Yeah, no, it was all a real name. I mean, I think it's kind of similar. I think the advantage I had was that I didn't actually belong to any organization. So if you were to Google me at the time, actually what came up, my first book was published, the most Googleable thing on me actually was my novel that I published. So I did have this other identity of being a novelist. Also, I was, when I approached the organization, actually, my official role was a Fulbright Research Grant Scholar. So I could also say I'm a scholar connected to an organization, which is Fulbright Educational Organization, applying for an educational organization. So there's all these factors that really kind of worked why, although if you were to then look carefully, then you would have seen my other nonfiction journalistic pieces that I'd done. But I feel like they didn't do careful enough vetting, because the vetting was actually done by the university that was hiring me, which was an international evangelical organization. I also was benefited by the fact that it was their first year. So they were really not that organized. So I think they kind of actually messed up. So it was those chances that they didn't do the work. So I think that's how another aspect was passing off as an evangelical Christian. I'm not Christian. So that took more work. I never actively said, this is my church, because because all the missionaries there who were teachers had a backing of a church back home, which obviously I didn't have, but nobody asked me which one is your church. So and also I was benefited by the fact that evangelicals could not discuss their religion in North Korea. North Korean regime was aware of who they were, but they made an unofficial deal between the two. The organization was working in collaboration with the regime. Their promise to the regime was that they'll never discuss Christianity. So I was also benefited by the fact that although I know nothing about the Bible,
They weren't asking you about the Bible while you were there.
Talk about it.
That helps. Tracie, I understand, you were the only white woman working in these fields with mostly Mexican workers, right?
Yes.
Did you feel like you had to come up with a ready explanation for why a woman who looks like you was working in the fields?
Yes. So, I was really aided by the fact that my Spanish isn't very good. So it's very difficult if I'm communicating in Spanish to tell that I have any native intelligence or education. And so I would just sort of be, in very broken Spanish, I would be like, well, I am looking for work, and I have a lot of problems, and I don't want to talk about them, and I don't want to work in a store and have to talk to people and be nice to them. And people would look at me, and I'd be like, as long as I can make minimum wage out here, like, I would like to do this. And people were a bit incredulous, but eventually it just sort of devolved into, at least from what I could tell, that like, well, that's just like a really broke white lady who's having a hard time. Because if you just keep showing up, they're like, something terrible has happened to her.
She really needs this job.
And initially, right, like in my head, I was like, oh, I'm some sort of tragic figure, and they'll think I have all these family problems, and then eventually I was like, oh, or a drug problem. Like, that often ended up being like people assumed I had some like thing with drugs, and so they were like worried or hopeful to partner with me. But
that seemed to be a common theme. I know, like Shane, you've said before that you didn't feel like people were trying to pry into your personal life. Like you didn't offer up your background, and people kind of respected that.
Yeah, it's also a culture of prison. You don't ask people what they're in for. Everybody has some weird thing in their background, whether they're prisoners or guards, and people would say, like, they knew I was from California. I came to Louisiana for a $9 an hour job. People would be like, why the hell did you do that? And I would just say something like, you never know where life's going to take you, and that would be it.
It's kind of poetic.
But also prisoners asked me a lot more than guards about this, and there would be people that would say to me, like, there's something about you, you're after something, like they're trying to figure something out. Because I was asking them a lot of questions, I was talking to them a lot, and some of them, I'm pretty sure, thought that I wanted to sell contraband and was kind of feeling people out, and they were waiting for me to ask the question, and they, didn't want, they weren't going to be the ones, because then I could bust them,
James, I'm curious, when you were finding these activists to wear these secret cameras on them wherever they went, you talked a little bit about how it was relatively easy. It wasn't as, you were able to find them. Was it ever a concern that these were activists? These were not necessarily trained journalists who were choosing what to film and when to film, and how did you navigate around like authenticating the footage or just knowing whether they portrayed what happened fairly?
Yeah, it's an ethically complex area, because on the one hand, you have to treat them as part of your team in terms of your responsibility for their safety, because they are filming for your project. It's slightly different with Saudi in that people were filming clips on their cell phones and sharing them, so we kind of tapped into that network. But in terms of the guy who's filming undercover, I had to write a security protocol as if it was me going there, and I had to take his decisions on what to film as seriously as I would my own if I were going to Gaza or Syria or wherever. But obviously he's not a journalist, and his motivation is not money or fame, it's to reveal the reality of life there. And I think ultimately and actually North Korea, in terms of the undercover footage, it's like the Wild West. People will offer you whatever you want, like, give me $50,000 and we'll get you a shot of a prison camp. And so you've just got to kind of use your experience and your judgment on who are people that are responsible, take these things seriously, will take guidance. Basically, it's the same thing I would say if I was I'm working with a cameraman at the moment who's filming in Mosul. He's a French cinematographer, and my relationship with him is comparable to my relationship with the activist in terms of their safety. It's nothing is more important than your safety. No story, no shot is worth, you taking a risk that you're not comfortable with. And then in terms of journalistically how you present that, you just have to be very clear and transparent that these are activists who are doing this to reveal a reality that they think is important, and our kind of motives in this instance are kind of aligned in that we want to be able to report on countries that are repressive and lock up journalists and don't allow certain elements of everyday life to be revealed.
Is it almost harder asking someone else to take on physical risks for the reporting you want to get done?
Absolutely.
I mean, and physical safety is something I want to talk about with each of you, but in your case, Yasser, he was attacked by religious police while he was filming. I think he had his finger broken. He was just hanging out in the open, playing the lute with his friends.
Right.
And then there was this scene where he was approached by religious police, and then the film went black.
Yeah. I mean, that was a horrible, horrible moment. I just got a voice message on Telegram, the encrypted app that we use, and it was him sounding very distressed and kind of panting, speaking in Arabic. And I had no idea what he was saying, and I couldn't get hold of our Arabic translator for like half an hour, and I was terrified he'd been arrested or whatever. And then by the time we got back in touch with him, he was like, "Oh, I'm fine, just hurt my finger,"
Just my finger.
But no, I remember when we did the North Korea thing, that was the first time we'd kind of used this model of working with activists. And I went into Channel 4, the British broadcaster, to do the security protocol. And I came out, and I was like, I don't think we can do this. I don't think I can be satisfied, to the extent that I'm happy to send this person in. Because as a journalist, you don't want to feel that you're putting people in danger that you wouldn't want to put yourself in.
Right.
But with countries like North Korea, Saudi Arabia, or ISIS-controlled Raqqa, there are stories that are really important, and the only way you're going to get them is by working with activists who are brave enough to get them out. So there's got to be, if you want to tell those stories, you want to reveal things that these repressive regimes don't want the world to see, you've got to make some kind of compromises. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, we did actually go ourselves as well, but me there, even posing as a businessman, was never going to get
the same kind of footage.
The same sort of footage in the deepest slum, in school, with school children talking about the hatred they were being taught about at school. So it's a kind of unique thing that they offer, which is the unvarnished reality of places like this.
I want to stay on this theme of physical safety and go to Tracie, because when you were out in the fields, I mean, not only were your hands constantly swollen and blistered, you almost suffered heat stroke, you developed a sprain. And I'm curious, did you have an exit strategy in your mind going into this situation where you said to yourself, if it gets to a certain level of bad, I am pulling out of this project? Did you plan that out?
Not really. I mean, I was like, well, if it gets really bad and I get sick, or if I think it's really dangerous, I'll leave. But what I didn't really take into account is that I'm really stubborn. And I also, I mean, I was just raised in a way where, like, I kind of will put up with an awful lot, like if I think that there's a benefit at the end of it for me, right? And I was sort of like, I'm going out to do this work. My job is to go out and get this story and do this reporting. And I'm not gonna just like pick up and leave because like, I skinned my knee or something like that. And part of me really felt like I'm gonna prove that I can hack this and I can do this. So like I had like little contingency plans, like when I was when I was going out into the fields, advocates had told me, people die pretty much every year in the fields from heat stroke. You need to be really careful. And I was like, okay, I'll look this up. And I was like, oh, all right, well, like if your body temperature gets above like X, that's when you're at danger for heat stroke. So I'm gonna take a thermometer with me and I'll keep it on me. And then if I start feeling crappy, I can go to the porta potty and take my temperature. And then if I've reached like the 103 temperature, whatever it is, then I have to leave, which is totally impractical, right? Because I'm like a half a mile from the porta potty. I'm trying to get my work done. I mean, nobody really thinks by that time that I might be a journalist. They're like, that's just some weird person. But like, when I started getting sick, like you lose some of your cognitive ability, right? Like you slow down, you get sort of very like confused and disoriented. And later it's like, oh, that thing where I couldn't find my car right after the shift, that's disorientation. But I hadn't put that together, right? Because I was getting sick and like went home and projectile vomited for an afternoon and was like, oh, I should go to some air conditioning, because this was a period that's fairly normal in the Central Valley, but it was like a week of 105-degree heat. And so I was like, I need to go hide.
And again, you were there, this was your project, this is your book. It's not like you were sent there by a news organization.
Right.
You weren't constantly checking in with an editor. Shane, you were sent there by Mother Jones. And I mean, to talk about the physical safety issue in your case is really obvious. I mean, you witnessed stabbings, you were verbally threatened multiple times, there was an escape while you were there. Did your editors have an exit strategy for you? Did they say it needs to stop at such and such kind of point, or what?
There was no kind of like, amount of time that I was supposed to be there. It was left pretty open, and we would check in, throughout to see how it was coming along. But, that stuff it's really kind of abstract, honestly. I mean, I would say, like, if something really bad happens, I'll leave. But that's in the context of prison where people are getting stabbed all the time, I mean, it's like, yeah, if I got stabbed, I would have left. That's clear. But, like, up to that, I mean, and also the thing with this kind of work is that you're deep in, I mean, and you become a culture to it. You are in a world that everybody around you is in. So I'm not in a uniquely dangerous situation, really. I mean, I'm in the same boat as everyone else there, and learning the culture of this extremely violent place. And there's a similar thing where it's like, I'm inside, this is never gonna happen again, and I'm getting so much good material, and there's always the question of, like, what happens tomorrow, if I leave today, what if the thing is tomorrow, but then there is a point where it's like, you kind of hit saturation and, realize, like, you're not getting stuff every day anymore, it's kind of becoming normalized, and you start losing perspective.
Suki, you were under constant surveillance by the North Korean government. Can you talk a little bit about, physical danger wasn't this ever-present daily risk, but there was always the possibility that if you were found out, who knows what would have happened to you if you were apprehended by the North Korean government. Can you talk about how you navigated around being constantly surveilled, like your computer was being monitored? There was a camera in your room where you were sleeping, right?
Well, I guess because, by the time I went and lived there, it's been already 10 years of following North Korea, so I knew what the exact consequences were. So camera, I didn't have a proof. I knew the room was bugged. Camera, I knew was a possibility. So even to keep the notes, I came out of there with about 400-page notes. And I would write, at dawn and in the middle of the night. And I had a laptop because my cover was as an ESL teacher. So, which I carried with me everywhere, never left it in the room. But I did, even if sometimes I would have to leave it, so I would keep everything on USB sticks and erase the trace every single time I signed off. And then I carried it like on my body at all time, like a necklace like this. And then I kept the copy on SD card, and then I would hide it with a light off somewhere, because obviously I need a backup. What if I lose this USB sticks? And then also I created like a document within a document. So if you were to open it, it looked like a school lesson material, teaching material, and the real book begins like page 100. So there were all these methods that I had to do to cover the trace. But also I think there were, because the minders lived, and their job literally is to watch over me 24/7 downstairs. And then also there was a fear of the evangelicals, because they could also decide, wait a minute, what is she doing? She's not one of us. So it was a sort of like this double fear all the time. Evangelical issue, I knew they would probably kick me out. They're not going to really report me to the North Korean authority. The minders, however, that fear was real. And I didn't have an exit strategy. I think that I knew that the consequences would definitely be espionage. I mean, that's what the notes would prove. So I just didn't think of, once my mind went there, I just sort of, because then I was petrified. And, it's not like I'm a war correspondent. I think that I just was terrified and just kept as much as just keeping it on my body was the only thing I could do.
I also want to talk a little bit about navigating empathy when you were undercover. Usually in journalism, we think of empathy as a good thing, but when you're so deeply immersed in this world and you're growing close to the people in this world that you're observing and recording and reporting on, but you're forming relationships with, is empathy something you actually have to keep in check to maintain journalistic distance? And I kind of want to go to you, Tracie, to start off on this question, because we were talking yesterday how you formed some real friendships with some of these people you worked alongside of. Did it ever feel awkward or uncomfortable pretending to be someone you weren't?
Yeah, especially in the early part of the reporting, the farm labor reporting I did was much more intimate than the other two jobs, right? Which were, Applebee's and Walmart. You go to your workplace and hang out there. And so my emotional relationships in those parts of the book are really like me hanging out with roommates and friends and things like that, where it's not at conflict, right, with the research that I'm doing. But in the fields, right, I mean, like when I first started working in the Central Valley, my mayordomo, like my supervisor, or like crew leader, was the next door neighbor who was like helping me out in the trailer park, right? And so then she took me into the fields with her first to sell food that she had made, and then she put me on a crew for grapes and things like that. And that became very quickly very controversial for me internally, because we were like, she was freaking out at her kids and losing her temper and then feeling bad about it, and then be like, well, my dad has a temper too, and we had some problems and blah, blah, blah. And then it would, turn into this very emotional conversation between two grown women talking about their childhoods, right? And like, that was honest and real. And so initially I really felt conflicted about that. And I just had to call my agent and talk through it, and was sort of like, well, this is the deal. Like, if you're going to do this work, you've got to be comfortable with this and make sure that you feel ethically fair about it. And I was like, well, if I tell her later, and if like that's fair, and I'll cross the bridge when I come to it if she's doing something like like my supervisor that I think is unethical. And in that instance, like, I just didn't cross that. I didn't come to that, so it was fine.
Suki, similarly, you had meals almost every day with these students. You talk about personally really caring about them. At the same time, you were recording them, observing them, learning about them as a journalist. How did you negotiate between getting close to them and caring about them, but also being a journalist?
It's interesting because I get asked that question a lot, where people would say things like, do you miss your students? Because I really did fall in love with them all, because it's a locked compound. It's like a prison where you're really stuck living with each other and spending every minute of the day together. And North Korean, although they were 20-year-olds, they were actually a lot younger mentally, because abuse, and this is basically abuse control system, right? Infantilized nation is just younger. So I felt really motherly towards them. And I wanted to protect them. But, at the same time, they were never my sons. These were subjects. I went in there with a journalistic purpose. And I feel like, and that love that I feel, I did not that long ago, a piece where I was embedded with human traffickers in China. I did a long-form journalism reported piece for the New Republic. And even that one, I kind of felt the same way, of this empathy for the subject. Because I do feel that most strong writing comes out when it's most sincere, as much as you possibly can for that subject. So I think that balance, for me, I don't think it was ever an issue, because you do always, it's a professional relationship, even if you fall absolutely in love with your subject. And I think, for me, journalism, I do think that you have to empathize with your subject for the writing to have power.
I want to throw the empathy question also to Shane, because what happened in your project over months, like, you thought you were going to be reporting on the prisoners, but then you ended up identifying also as a prison guard and their situation. And what I was really fascinated with when I was reading about your account was, you said the longer you became a guard, the more and more of a guard you became to be. I mean, you would take genuine pleasure sometimes in exerting authority. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what you felt like was happening to you as your role was engulfing yourself as a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of crazy making in a way, because I would be in the prison and I would get, I would be in guard mode in the prison, especially after I'd been there a couple months, and, I'd be just immersed in this very complex web of power, and I'd have many conflicts I was managing, and I would just get so wrapped up in that, and then I would leave and go home, and I would kind of come back to my normal self, and I would often be ashamed of that, that I was kind of becoming that person. But it was like I was going back and forth. And other guards kind of say the same thing. Like they talk about having these kind of two lives. And, I guess as far as empathy, I think that I think it's a very challenging thing to manage, and there are a lot of questions that come with it. But it's also one of the strengths of immersion reporting is that you really come to understand and empathize with the people you're around, even if they're people that you would maybe caricaturize if you weren't so immersed. When I first started, when I got stationed in my unit in the prison, and I met my work partner, there was a while where I was like disappointed. I was like, this is the guy who's going to be the character, and he's kind of banal, and he wasn't like a stereotype. And, I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, but that is way more interesting. But, you kind of, you don't, you can't stereotype people in that way once you get to know them enough. It gets much more complex.
I want to spend some time before we go to questions getting at some of these larger journalism ethics questions that we were sort of talking about at the beginning of the panel. When is undercover reporting justified? And anyone can jump in on these larger questions. Is it something we should use very judiciously? When does a situation merit undercover reporting? Does anyone want to take that?
I'll say one interesting thing for me, having been speaking to people the last few days about undercover reporting here, is that in the UK it's far more mainstream, far more accepted as a process. I don't know whether that's part of our tabloid culture or what, but your starting point when you're investigating an organization, a group, or a country is, can we find a whistleblower? Can we find a case study? Or can we get in there undercover? It's a basic tool you would use, and you don't use it unless you absolutely have to, unless there's absolutely no other way of getting the information or getting the footage. And you keep the deception to a minimum. But and actually, interestingly, I had that experience with the Saudi film. In the UK version, we included our trip where we set up a fake business, went to a cybersecurity conference. And filmed secretly. We thought we'd be one of many kind of Western companies there, and actually turned out we were the only ones. And our stall was right next to the Ministry of Interior, so like very senior Saudi policemen. But FRONTLINE and PBS, it just wasn't part of their kind of grammar of journalism. It was one thing for activists to be using subterfuge and filming secretly without people's knowledge, but for us as filmmakers to take that decision, particularly with a country like Saudi where they do allow some journalists in. You can go potentially and interview the foreign minister, but you won't be able to film the reality of life for Saudis, most likely. But it's I think there is a kind of journalistic difference between Britain and America.
Do you think some of that openness in Britain towards undercover reporting is because we're just more litigious in the United States against journalists who have gone undercover? Is that what maybe is driving the culture here?
In Britain,
there's plenty of litigation in Britain.
It's not like we just do it gung ho. Right, yeah. The lawyers to countenance filming undercover, you have to have prima facie evidence of serious wrongdoing, probably criminal. So a lot of preparation and investigation goes in before you get to take a camera in anywhere. So I don't think it's that. I think it's a kind of cultural thing. I think journalists here maybe see themselves as more, I don't know, I think they look down their noses on undercoverers. It's like there's just something kind of unethical, something a bit dirty about it.
But also, I think that there is a code of ethics according to the Society of Professional Journalists, which is that when the traditional methods don't work, and also if the information is vital to the public. So I think that we could judge depending on situations. So what that also means, though, I think when we say the information is vital to the public, then it's an incredibly important information. I felt in my case, the truth inside North Korea where no one has lived undercover, this information needs to get out. The psychology of the leadership has to come out somehow for us to know better. So I thought it was vital to the public. But what that also means is that I don't think that you can exploit undercover, because I see it all the time where, you would go for a week as a tourist and you could claim that as an undercover work. Not really, because in 1 week in North Korea, you're not going to find anything that is going to really broaden any understanding. Like the first time I went to North Korea, when I went there for 8 days and did a piece for New York Review, it wasn't really that information I brought out was not going to be vital to the public, I felt. So I do think it's just an incredibly in-depth work, and I think that has to worth, it's that important.
Another issue I wanted to talk about is also the people that you were interacting with while you were undercover. These were people who didn't get to decide for themselves whether they even wanted to talk to a reporter. They weren't granted that autonomy because they didn't know you were a reporter, even though their thoughts or their statements and their conduct was being recorded and observed by you guys. I'm just curious, what do we do with that? I mean, usually we want to give people that choice, but when you go undercover, you don't give people that choice. And we're not talking about the high-level executives, we're talking about workers in the fields or other prison guards. And like, how did you feel about not giving people that choice? Annie?
I mean, I can say, the sort of initial thing I did is I just made sure that I changed everybody's identity and obscured it sufficiently so that there would be no way to identify who they were. So like that granted them a certain level of anonymity with the folks I was still in touch with. I gave some folks options to like read through some passages and be like, look, if you want me to use your real name, you can read this. We can talk about this. I make no promises that I will change it, but we can have a conversation about this. Not because I was gonna be like, oh, you're upset about X, Y, or Z, but because I wanted to make sure that, folks had some sensibility of like what was coming for them, especially if they were open to having their name used. And so some of the folks in my book, their actual name is used because, we had that conversation.
What about when you were applying for the jobs, this difference between affirmatively lying about who you are versus just not telling people who you are? Why is that a distinction that makes a difference? There are some newsrooms who would say in both cases there's deception involved, but why, if any of you want to take on this question, why is one form of not identifying yourself more preferable than the other?
I think that we should be thinking about, as journalists, we deceive people all the time. It's a part of our job. We interview people. We all know the experience of interviewing someone and them opening up thinking that what they're saying is in their interest when actually it isn't. We create those situations all the time. And we might hear something and not tell the person, I'm a reporter. We might, have somebody tell us the worst experience of their lives and know that they don't really understand the full implications of what it means for that to be published. And we do it. And, I think also something that is a normal part of this craft is, especially when you're doing narrative, is we have, a subject we're interested in, and we get into researching it, and then we set out to find a character that will kind of bring it to life. And in that process, there is a dishonesty in that process. We automatically, generally, I think, are choosing somebody that embodies a version of the story that we want to tell. And, so we're shaping something in a way that is much more shaped than when you're just, put in a situation, you have to write about what's around you. You just write about what comes. And I think in some ways, there is a certain deception in that, because you're not going around telling everyone you're a journalist, but there's also a way that's more truthful, the story itself. Mm-hmm. Because the people you're talking to aren't acting, for one. It's unfiltered, and you're not choosing the kind of raw material. Of course you're choosing from, if you're in a situation for months, you're choosing key moments, and, it's all storytelling, but you're just having to literally look at the thing that's there, and you don't get to kind of handpick, who are going to be the stars of your story.
Also, I think that's covering a topic where, I mean, in the case of North Korea, where basically the entire thing is a lie. You know, everybody lies to you. If you were to say this is on record, let's start talking, then literally everything is a lie. So then if you were to actually write about it and they are not aware that they're being written about, I mean, this was a real dilemma. But I think that in my own way, it was like really a judgment thing, you know, like I have to just have my own judgment because I didn't also have anyone, my editor was just not at all involved in the book. And in your own best of your ability, protecting them is one thing, you know, changing everything in the book, but protect them, like, you know, if they're gonna be in a compromising position, for example, that was never, like, I would have deleted that in a second. So in a way, you try to stay most sincere as possible to the story. And I think that I felt in this case of trying to reflect the humanity of what's inside is the best I possibly could. It's not a perfect solution, but you know, some of these topics are just not a perfect topic at all where journalism works. And you know, in this case, traditional journalism, I mean, in this case, traditional journalism, where you know reporters all go into North Korea and come back out with kind of this fantasy version of North Korea, is actually profiting the regime. So how honest is that? You know, when the reporters come out with these shining pictures of Pyongyang, for example, the school where I was at, BBC came in there, and it looked really great. This is a year everybody's in manual labor doing construction fields. But they only got to see actually these really rich kids looking healthy in this really fancy school built by foreigners. So that reporting, I felt, that's a traditional journalism. The journalists didn't have a choice, but that reporting ended up actually benefiting the regime. So I do think some of this case by case, you know, it's just not a perfect situation.
It's really fascinating, this whole debate of like, what's more truthful reporting, the undercover stuff, the stuff that you get that's unfiltered when people don't know you're a reporter. On the other hand, you could make the argument that when people don't know you're a reporter and they don't think that they're going to be made accountable for what they say, they can tell you whatever they want. And, you know, we don't know what they're making up because they're not actually thinking, wow, my statement might be made public one day. But let me open it up to questions because we're almost, unless you wanted to respond.
Oh, I mean, there's ways to try to mitigate some of that, which, you know, we did with this story and with the militia story, which, like, you know, one thing that we did was I reached out to everybody in the story that appears before, you know, it was published. And so you can go, and not everybody's going to do that. Not everyone's going to talk to you, but a lot of people did. And, you know, you can go back and kind of flesh out some of those things if you're not sure what, you know, did you really mean that or what was going on here?
Yeah. All right, let's open it up for questions. I bet there's a ton. How about you in the front here with the gray blazer?
Hi, I'm Mike Hickson-Baugh with the Houston Chronicle. I'm just kind of astonished by the level of personal sacrifice that at least three of you had to do to make this happen. You know, journalists are great about prodding into other people's lives, but maybe not always discussing your own. And I'm curious about the conversations you had to have with loved ones or with, you know, negotiations you had to be able to just put your life on pause for 4 months or for a year or for, you know, months at a time to do miserable work or put yourself in a dangerous situation. And the kind of the calculus you had to make is this worth it, you know, to move across the country? And I'll just open that up to any of you.
I mean, I'll just be like, I was 32 and single, so I was sort of like, well, my staff job is over. I really care about investigative work. I can't seem to get myself hired anywhere. So I guess if I want to do like meaningful work and not end up working like in a finance publication, I should try to do a book. And I just was very naive about it. I was like, I'll just go do this and it'll be like 2 months at a time and I'll come back to New York and it'll be fine. And it ended up being like, I didn't live in my own apartment for several years. I ended up on food stamps like for real, not for exploring. Which was really not part of the plan. But it was interesting, right? Because, like, you know, in terms of like the family I grew up with, like, they're just like Midwesterners who like work at like this, you know, the jury agency or whatever, and they're like, you're gonna go write some stuff, okay, like that's fine, you know, and it's not that big of a negotiation for someone like me.
I actually, it's actually a question that my mother actually couldn't. I mean, she lost her brother to North Korea, so it was actually her worst nightmare. So she couldn't actually talk to me through the whole thing. I think she was actually angry, worried. In the case of North Korea, the theme of forced separation and longing is actually what I felt was at the crux of North Korean tragedy. If I have 1 million families who are forcibly separated by this division that was, colonially happened, it's a Cold War decision, and what that did to all these people who missed each other, and why being in that forced place where I was not allowed to ever contact the outside world, how horribly difficult it was, I ended up putting it in the book. That was my solution of dealing with what it's like to be in a controlled place where you can't contact anybody. So my solution of dealing with that was just actually throwing it in the book.
Anyone else? Back there, black t-shirt, standing up.
So I had the pleasure of working with some of the graduate level students in the program here at Berkeley, investigating the work of David Deladen in his undercover reporting of Planned Parenthood. And it was interesting to watch him and the students and the courts struggle with whether what Deladen did was undercover reporting or propaganda. And essentially the decision of deciding that, and it's actually in the Ninth Circuit now, and the courts are still wrestling whether Deladen waived his First Amendment rights by falsehoods in securing his undercover access, was in looking at the outtakes of his work, what he didn't use. And given that the public doesn't have the ability to look at your outtakes and look over your shoulder and decide whether you're reporters or propaganda artists, how do you distinguish yourself, or do you, with people like Deladen, and how do you help your audience make those distinctions?
That's a great question.
I mean, do people ever get to look at our outtakes? I think it's the same question it's just a question of storytelling. I don't think if you're undercover or not, you still have to, you have to be maybe more diligent than you do in doing other work. And you can turn that into propaganda, or you can turn kind of more straightforward journalism into propaganda. I think for me, one of the ways that I deal with this question is I think it's important that transparency is very important in doing this kind of work. And I think in investigative reporting in general, but being transparent with the reader, telling the reader, how you did all this stuff, why you made the choices you did, and just showing the work as much as possible, and just being, really truthful with them. And I think when you do that, people know. But how can they ever tell? Yeah.
That will challenge your credibility.
Mm-hmm.
So trust me, I don't think in this current society works.
But I think that's an issue that media is dealing with a lot right now, because the trust of the media is very low. And why? I think some of that is a perception that journalists have been cozy to power. There is a sense, there are issues like with polling and all that stuff that we dealt with during the elections. So people have this sense that things are being spun. And I think when you're telling a story, whether it's undercover or not, and you're showing these kind of different aspects that might, even if if somebody reads my story, they're probably assuming that I don't love private prisons. But everything in the story isn't to that end. This is a complex world, and I think anytime you're telling a story that's not showing that, there's no contradictions in it, that always is going to raise that question of what's being left out here. I think it's just something we always deal with as writers.
James?
Yeah, I would just add to that when you make an undercover film, you apply the same rigorous standards you would to anything else. You know that if you're taking on a big target, they're damn likely going to make a complaint. In the UK, it's called Ofcom. It's like the journalistic standards. And you're going to have to hand over the transcript. You're going to have to hand over the raw footage. And if you've misrepresented it, that's it. Your film, one little bit that you get wrong wasn't exactly what you said it was. Your credibility's shot. The whole film was a fake, And it's happened to filmmakers that I know. They had one, undercover investigations that were 99% solid. They got one thing wrong, and that's it. It sticks. So, you have to be so, so careful with every last detail. And I think we're totally different to someone who is going in there with that kind of agenda and is going to distort the evidence that he gathers. Our job is to present the real picture that we've managed to gather. So I think, there are checks and balances. I don't know exactly what the process is here, but I'd imagine it's similar.
More questions? In the back, yes.
Hi, my name is Laura Morel. How did you cope with the isolation, and what was it like transitioning back to your real lives after your undercover experience?
I really needed therapy. I was also, when I was there, the end was very sudden because although it was decided that I was going to leave, Kim Jong-il died on my last day, which of course, first thing I thought was, wow, here's the final chapter of my book. And I thought there must be God, because I was with all she said. So I finally became Christian at the end. So it was really jarring because then the whole country shut down in front of me. So it was really frightening. Of course, the journalist part of me wanted to stay on. That wasn't possible. But I couldn't say goodbye to any of the students. So there was a heartbreak, and it was really, mix of all that. And then, of course, coming out of the airport, where just littered with foreign journalists, because whoever is coming out of the plane had now just witnessed Pyongyang under Kim Jong-il's death. What was really interesting about that, I guess this is a whole disturbing part of it, because I'd actually seen everything and the reaction of my students that are not forced on the streets of Pyongyang for the camera only, and none of those reporters grabbed me from the plane because I guess I just look like I'm not I guess I just passed or something. So I think that I guess none of them assumed that I could possibly have been a journalist from there. So I think I was also very struck how how normal the world was. When you've been there in so long, it's a lack of everything, and the outside world is just so plenty of stuff and just normal. And that I just didn't watch. I feel like for several months I couldn't leave home, and I couldn't bear to watch those, constantly Pyongyang on camera of North Korean crying in fit of tears. For me, that looked like theater, not because they were performing for the camera, but the coverage of it was, none of it was what I saw in North Korea in a way. So it was depressing. There was no one to share this with. So it was truly isolating more back home.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Oh, did you have a? Oh, one more question. Okay, who's going to be the winner? Lady in the blazer with the brown dots.
Hi, Isabeau Doucette from AJ+. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the aftermath. Can you get back into North Korea? How are the Saudi bloggers? Were there any lawsuits from CCA or, Walmart?
The Yasser, who's in our film as the main undercover guy, the film was put on YouTube and watched by hundreds of thousands of people inside Saudi. And he told a great story of the day after it had gone out, sitting in his university class, and the whole class talking about it, being like, oh my God, did you see that film? Talking about the details of it, and him just kind of quietly sitting there like. So he's gone back to ordinary life. The network is still filming stuff. I can't go back to Saudi. Don't particularly want to. And, but the activists carry on. We've made our film, but that's not their end goal. Their end goal is, getting rid of King Salman, the dictator, the regime.
No, I can't go back to North Korea. But I was, I had a whole other life after, because the book, despite all of that, was actually the publisher decided to package it as a memoir, no matter how much I fought that this is based on journalistic notes. And I couldn't win that battle. And from then on happened a series of events that I didn't foresee, where I was attacked constantly for lying to get into North Korea, because they no longer saw it as journalism, but that in fact I deceived evangelicals, and New York Times did a story in the international section on my deception. So it had this chain of reaction that I didn't disqualify from all nonfiction awards, because it was no longer perceived as journalism. And I really didn't understand why all these criticisms were happening. If it was it because it's literary investigative nonfiction, or is it, I didn't really have an answer, because I felt that this was a perfect case of sexism. I didn't think it would have happened if I were not a female, or if I were not an Asian female, because all the books on North Korea are actually by white journalists, and by Korean women are victim's confession. So I couldn't get, it just went on and on and on. And I ended up actually writing an essay about the whole experience of why my expertise is being taken away. These are not based on my feelings, it's based on my research of 10 years. And it's also a psychology of the future leadership during Kim Jong-il's final year. So, and that's how actually we met. Because when my essay came out in the New Republic, where I confronted all of these accusations, where they called me paranoid and a liar all around, all the big reviews, why was it so hard to look at undercover journalism and give it a credit as it is, instead of a woman who's deceitful, who lied to get into North Korea? And this is actually, Shane was really kind, because we met and you addressed the issue.
No, because that essay came out at the same time my story came out, so it was really interesting to see. I wasn't getting those questions,
No one ever accused you of not doing undercover reporting, that it was not actual
or even
journalism.
was accusing me of being deceptive. I mean, and our approach is actually very similar. It was a different topic, but yeah, it was just interesting. I read the essay and saw a lot of the chatter about it in social media and stuff, and it was just striking how different it was.
Well, I feel like we could talk about this for so many more hours, but we have to get off the stage, and I just want to thank you guys so much. Oh, you need that. You need that one.